word you use?
Spoilers.
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 Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers.
I like that word.
I thought you might.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Review Who, the first of 2018. And today we will be tackling the tale of a tiresome Time Lord who tears up the history books in, of course, the Time Meddler. I'm going to be perfectly honest here. The Time Meddler, as a historical story of the invading Vikings and Normans, is somewhat of a loose end. It is not very memorable. However, as the sci-fi elements enter into the mix, and it becomes much more of a sci-fi story than a historical one, then does it become one that you will certainly remember, because this is the first time we start to learn a bit more about the Doctor's own people. What can I say about this story? Well, it's a bit all over the place. A historical sci-fi? Or a sci-fi with historical elements? It's actually quite hard to pin down this story into one or the other. Maybe because this was Doctor Who's first real venture into a blend of the two, that it does feel a little bit off at times. Rather like fitting two random pieces of the same jigsaw puzzle together. You know that they form the same overall picture, but those two pieces don't necessarily go together. Of course, further on into its future, Doctor Who became no stranger to this, and the idea of historical stories with sci-fi elements became pretty much the show's go-to idea alongside purely sci-fi stories, with the purely historical stories being more or less forgotten, which I personally think is a bit of a shame. However, whilst the overall plot of the story is a bit here and there, this story does contain some very interesting firsts. Although he appeared in the previous story, this is the first full story of Peter Purves as Stephen Taylor as a companion. Again, although the previous story had elements of it, as previously mentioned, this is the first pseudo-historical story, that is to say, historical but with science fiction elements. We see the first appearance of another Time Lord, the Doctor and Susan accepted, in the form of the meddling monk.
Look, I take it you both come from the same place, Doctor.
Yes, I regret that we do, but I would say that I am 50 years earlier.
And lastly, whilst it isn't explicitly stated, the Doctor's shunning of those who meddle in time could be seen as the first reference to the Time Lord's policy of non-interference.
You know as well as I do the golden rule about space and time travelling. Never interfere with the course of history.
Although, to be fair to the monk, the Doctor isn't exactly known for adhering to the non-interference policy himself. Another thing that lets this story down somewhat is its lack of action. That's not to say there isn't any, but if you're looking for a story about invading Vikings and Normans, looting, pillaging and ravishing fair maidens, then there is some of this, but it does take somewhat of a sideline next to the science fiction elements. And even then, the sci-fi side of the story takes much of its action through its dialogue. The Doctor's discovery of who the monk is, what his intentions are, and how he intends to stop his meddling. However, probably the best moment of action in this story is quite a subtle one, and I think that's why it works. At the end of episode 3, Stephen and Vicky find a power cable coming from inside a sarcophagus, and after finding doors in the side of it, they are greeted by another TARDIS. There is nothing particularly shocking or sudden about this revelation, especially as most people going into this story these days will be aware of who the monk is. But in watching it, you do still get a sense of how surprising it must have been to audiences of the time. As many fans will know, TARDIS stands for Time and Relative Dimension in Space. Or is that dimensions? This is possibly one of the most often debated points amongst fans. However, it was in fact in this story that the controversy began, with Vicky telling Stephen that the D in TARDIS stood for the plural rather than the singular.
It stands for time and relative dimensions in space.
The reason for this was nothing more than an error on the part of Maureen O'Brien when delivering her lines. Nonetheless, this simple mistake not only gave rise to one of the most hotly debated points in Doctor Who history, but this led to the plural over the singular being retained for much of the classic series. Although there were a few exceptions, and the new series has reverted to using the singular over the plural. My personal viewpoint is that both are correct. Slightly different terms for the same thing. And in fact, with Susan referring to TARDIS in the plural dimensions in the Big Finish story at the beginning, which is set before the start of the classic series, it certainly seems to suggest, to me at least, that both in and out of the universe, both the singular and the plural are perfectly acceptable. If I had to sum up this story in one sentence, it would be an okay story, but one that you have to see. Do not go into watching this one with high expectations, but do go in to watching it. It's part of Doctor Who history that you can't afford to miss. It might not be the historical or sci-fi story that you were hoping for, but with the blend between historical and sci-fi balancing the two sides nicely, it is still one that is well worth seeing. And that brings to a close another Review Who. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, favourite, subscribe, share, it really helps me out a lot, and be sure to check out the description below for a link to my Patreon. There is an exclusive webcomic and rewards for people who support it, and the funding generated by my Patreon helps me fund future videos. And hopefully soon I will also be adding a special little thank you box to those who support my Patreon in the end screen of my videos. Click on my Patreon link to find out more. I salute you all, and I will see you with another video very soon.